Hi there, and welcome to this ski podcast special, an interview with Martin Bell, the downhill ski racer for Great Britain in the 80s and 90s. In this interview, we chat about his family, his brother Graham Bell, who also raced on the circuit, and his daughter Reece, who's currently racing slalom for Team GB. We talk about how he learned at an early age to ski in Scotland and went out to Austria at only 14 before joining the World Cup circuit. He also raced at 4 Winter Olympics. We have a chat about Calgary, where his 8th is still the best by a male British skier. We also talk about his appearance on Wogan in the build-up to those games in 1988. So sit back and enjoy. I'm delighted to welcome Martin Bell to the Ski Podcast today. I'm sure many of our listeners will know Martin. He raced for Great Britain in the 80s and 90s, and his racing career took in 4 Winter Olympics, 160 World Cup races, including 7 top 10 finishes, and his 8th at Calgary in 1988 remains the best placing by a British male skier at the Olympics. So, hi, Martin. Welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Very well, thanks. Healthy, so far, so good.
Excellent. And where are you?
I live in a town called Eagle, which is near Vail, Colorado.
Okay, so how is the snow this season? I take it you've been out on the slopes, have you?
Oh, yes, right since the early days of November, in fact. It's been a sort of average season snow-wise, maybe a little below average, but pretty decent.
Okay, and what's the sort of COVID situation in Colorado, in Vail? Do you need to wear masks? Are there limits on lift pass sales or anything? Are the restaurants open?
They limit the lift pass sales, although numbers are quite high, and we have had some queues. You have to have your mask on in the queue, and in fact, at any time when you're kind of around the base area, and even in the village, there is a mask mandate in the village. The mountain restaurants are open by reservation only, and much reduced capacity. The tables are spread out. I've actually been there a couple of times with the kids I coach, just if they got cold, and I felt pretty safe in there because they do have big gaps between the tables. So far everything's open and everything is kind of ticking along, and not too bad.
Excellent. And I think previously you were based in Big Sky in Montana before you moved to Colorado. I just wondered how long you've lived in the States and what took you over the pond.
Well, after I finished racing World Cup in 95, I got invited to do a couple of seasons on a professional downhill tour in the States. I actually got invited by the Aussie racer Steve Lee, a good mate of mine, who has had some terrible health issues recently. He had a stroke, the poor guy. But back in the late 90s, Steve and I teamed up and we raced on this professional circuit called the Jeep King of the Mountain. And I met an American lady called Laura, and we got married. We spent a bit of time in Colorado, a bit of time in London, and decided we preferred Colorado. Out here ever since, and we did have some time up in Montana, Big Sky, which is absolutely beautiful. And we actually moved back to Vail for our daughter to pursue her ski racing, because they have a very strong ski academy and club here in Vail for racing.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, you mentioned Reece. I was definitely going to ask you about her, but maybe let's just move on to her now. You mentioned your daughter's obviously very into her racing. She has recently joined GB Snow Sports ranks, and I think I'm right in saying she took part in her first Europa Cup events this winter. You must feel very proud. Do you think it's difficult for her following the footsteps of such a successful father?
Yeah, maybe. She's her own person. She's very strong-willed and competitive. So, she just does her own thing. And, she's doing slalom, whereas I was a downhiller and my brother was a downhiller. So she's making her own way in the world. And she's on the up. She's ranked 3rd in Britain now in slalom amongst the women. Behind Alex Tilley and Charlie Guest, who are our 2 kind of top performers with a lot of experience. And in fact, when Reece was at those Europa Cups, she was staying with Charlie Guest and her coach, Simone, and she really learned a lot from them. And Charlie was very helpful and welcoming. So she's also racing for her college. She's just started university in Denver. So they have a very strong college racing circuit over here in the States. She's getting into that as well.
That's great. Do you give her any race advice or coaching, or is that left to the Vail Club de Sport, or the Vail Race School?
No. I mean, I definitely, watch and give her advice, and it's up to her if she takes it. But generally, she knows her own tactics now, and she's obviously learned a lot. But I'm always there if she has questions, and equipment issues as well, because there's always stuff to work on in that area. So yeah, I'm kind of there in the background as a mentor. But her main coach now is really the Denver University coach, who is a guy called Andy Leroy. He actually competed for the US back in the '98 Olympics. And he actually did the British Slalom Championships in about '98 and won the British Slalom Championship title. So he and I have something in common there.
Right, okay. And can you remind me how old Reece is at the moment?
She's 19, so, she still has a lot of her career ahead of her.
Of course, yeah. Well, we wish her all the best. Now, you referred to Graham just then. I'm sure most of our listeners will know that your younger brother is Graham Bell, and we've interviewed Graham for the podcast several times before, most recently about his appearance on Dancing on Ice. Now, evidently, you have to be very competitive to be able to compete at World Cup and Olympic level. Do you think that sibling rivalry between you and Graham drove you both forward?
It did at certain times. When we were much younger, he was, quite a bit behind me and always chasing me. So it was driving him. I was chasing, the older boys, the Hillend crew, people like Midge White and Davy Mercer and Scott Dobson. So I was chasing the ones ahead of me, and my little brother was chasing me. And then once we got onto World Cup, Graham had some injuries, quite bad injuries early on. So it took him a while to establish himself. And so really in the later part of our careers, I think we became very competitive, and, one race, one of us would be ahead, and then the next race, the other one would be ahead. And, we didn't like being beaten by our brother, but we didn't like being beaten by anyone. And it was probably better to be beaten by your brother than some Austrian that you didn't know. So, we worked together. We definitely worked as a team within a team, and we pooled our skis, for example. We had a big group of skis that we tested together, and whoever was currently ahead in the rankings list that week got the first choice of the skis. So it was all done very fairly.
Right. Okay, that's good, because I think the kind of resources you had were probably not quite as good as what the British team are currently able to benefit from. So I guess those skis probably would be crucial in terms of your chances in any particular race.
Well, it's funny you say that. I actually think we were better supported in the '80s than the current British team is now. After we sent our daughter over to those Europa Cups I was talking about, we got sent a bill for the hotel and the coaching, and
right.
That was not the case. That was not the case in the '80s. We were supported to go to every race, hotel bills covered, coaches' fees covered. So, I think, back in the '50s and the '60s, it was definitely a rich man's game, and our ski racers were called names like, Piers. And now, we've got a bloke called Dave. So that has changed. But I do think we've taken a bit of a backward step. There is not as good support financially for the racers now as we had in the '80s and '90s, I'm sad to say.
Right. Okay. Well, that's really interesting and possibly a bit disappointing to hear that. I mean, I do recall at the time when I was following it, Drambuie were a big sponsor of the team, and they were very visible in the ski world. And it was always great to go to the ski show and be able to get just a little nip of Drambuie. You went to 4 Winter Olympics, I think. That was Sarajevo 84, Calgary 88, Albertville 92, and Lillehammer 94. I'm guessing Calgary was probably your favorite. Would that be the case?
I probably have the most vivid memories of Sarajevo because it was my first, and it's just so impressive to be in an Olympic village. And for a lot of the time when we were racing at Calgary, we were not in the village because it was too far away. So we were up at a place called Fortress Mountain, which no one has ever heard of, and actually it's closed down. But its biggest claim to fame was it was used in the movie Inception. If you see the winter sequences, that's Fortress Mountain. So we were up in this beautiful place, and it was only 20 minutes drive from where the skiing events were. But no, Sarajevo was definitely something special. The whole country seemed behind the Olympics. We had no inkling of what was going to happen to Yugoslavia just a few years later. It was really, a huge turnaround.
You mentioned at Calgary, you didn't stay in the athletes' village, and I think it was traditional for the British team to stay in the athletes' village at that time. Was it difficult to get the team managers to allow you to go for that Fortress Mountain base?
Actually, I don't remember it being a huge issue. We were lucky in that the downhill was early on in the schedule, which it always is. So after the downhill, we were able to move down to the village and take part in the more social activities. But no, up in Fortress Mountain, the difficult part was actually getting accommodation. And we were kind of in a changing area that was next to the toilets that they'd put a few bunk beds in just to accommodate us. And the only other team up there was the Austrian team. So we knew we were doing the right thing.
Right. Yeah, that's a good clue, isn't it? I think the profile, was very high then. I would call it the height of skiing, certainly probably in terms of the numbers of people going. I mean, I was working for Bladen Lines around that time. They were a massive company, so many people going on chalet holidays, and Ski Sunday definitely had a lot more viewers in those days. I think prior to the games, I read that you even appeared on the Wogan show with David Vine. That must have been quite, I don't know, nerve-wracking perhaps? I don't know.
It was just all a blur really, but it's actually out there on YouTube if you care to look for it. And it went pretty well. Me and Graham on the sofa, and the other star on the show was Greta Scacchi, the actress, who, we just were we were almost too scared to talk to her. We were just so much in awe of her. She just appeared in a movie called White Mischief, which was, had a few raunchy scenes in it. So yeah, it was a wonderful time. Ski Sunday was huge. Ski racing was the only game in town really, although freestyle was beginning to make its mark. It was a demonstration event in Calgary with moguls and aerials, and it was a great time.
And you say that, downhill was the only game in town, but it must have been strange being in the British team with all the attention that ended up falling on Eddie the Eagle Edwards with his attempts at ski jump.
Yeah, well, that came out of the blue. I mean, we had seen Eddie. We'd watched Eddie taking part in the New Year's ski jump at Garmisch for the couple of years before that. I think the year before Calgary, he had a really bad crash and broke his collarbone, and we didn't really expect him to be selected for the Olympics, but there was a loophole, because there had never been a British ski jumper. There were no qualification standards set for British ski jumping, so they just took anyone. Whereas, everyone else had to kind of qualify, and then the next time around in '92, they made Eddie qualify, and of course he didn't make the qualification. So it was a one-off. It was a special situation, and we were just amazed by what was going on. Eddie dancing on the theatre of a strip bar in Calgary and all sorts of stuff. And then we went home and released a single, and it went nearly to the top of the charts, didn't it? So, yeah, just the media feeding frenzy. If it suddenly latches onto someone, it changes their life. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I interviewed Eddie some time ago now, but I'll drop in the link in the show notes. So, you did all the Olympics on the World Cup races, and you mentioned, skiing with Graham and when Graham was younger. I think I'm right in saying that both you and Graham started skiing at a pretty young age. Could you give us some insight into how and where you learned to ski and how you developed your racing skills?
Well, we used to go hill walking up in North Wales and Scotland, and our mum actually had the idea that we should go up to the Cairngorms and try skiing one Easter. And we went to Karl Fuchs's legendary Struan House ski school in Carbridge and just learned as beginners there. At that time, we were still living on a Royal Air Force base down in England, but then 2 years later, we moved up to Edinburgh because we knew about Hillend. We had actually visited Hillend already before we moved to Edinburgh. And we wanted to be as close to Hillend and the skiing up at Cairngorm as possible. And we started racing. I was 8. My brother was 7. We started racing at Hillend with the Lothian Regional Ski Association there, and up at Cairngorm with the Scottish Ski Club. And we were able to ski every weekend. We actually had a caravan that we left up at the Loch Morlich campsite, which is a beautiful place. And we'd go up there every Friday night and then come back down Sunday evening. And every Thursday night we'd be up at Hillend training on the plastic. So we'd skied as much as we could. We even did grass skiing as well, because that was big in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And Hillend had its own grass skiing slope next to the plastic slope. So yeah, we did as much as we could. And then at the age of 14, I actually went out to ski academy in Austria. I was recommended to do it by one of the British team coaches who was an Austrian. But I was actually following in the footsteps of a Scottish girl called Kirsten Cairns, who'd already been out and attended the Schladming ski academy. And I went to the Stamm ski academy in Austria. And then a lot of other British racers did the same thing. Emma Carrick-Anderson also went to Schladming, and there were many others. In those days, there were no British-run ski academies in the Alps. Now there are. So it's easier for the British kids to go out and spend time in the Alps without having to get all their lessons in a different language,
For sure. So you, at 14 years old, you went out there on your own to the Stam's training academy. And so did you have like a private tutor or something who was giving you lessons in English as well? Or did you have to learn German really quickly?
No, my only private tutor was my friend Paul Hormont from Hormont Travel, who is the same age as me and was in my class. And he'd already been living in Austria for 5 years, so he was bilingual. And he translated when I wasn't sure what was going on. So he was a huge help. And he still lives in Innsbruck, and we're great friends still. And I probably couldn't have done it without Paul.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. He went on to found, I'm guessing, Hormont Travel, the big schools travel company. Is that right?
Actually, that was founded by his father, but Paul took it over, and then he sold it for a nice chunk of change. And he's since then started other schools travel companies, and that is still his business. Obviously, it's on a bit of a hiatus at the moment, but no, he's still in the travel business and doing very well.
Okay. And did Graham then go out and join you in Stams at some point as well?
He did not. He finished his schooling in Edinburgh at 16 and just became a ski racer full time from the age of 16.
Right.
And like I said, he was progressing well, but then he had a bad knee injury, ACL, and that kind of slowed him down for a while.
Yeah, those things do happen. I mean, what age was it then that you made your World Cup debut?
Well, that was actually at 16.
Wow.
Then the next year, I had an ACL injury. One thing I didn't mention, Reece had an ACL injury when she was 17. So it's almost like a rite of passage to be a ski racer called Belle you have to have an ACL in your late teens. So yeah, I actually started racing World Cup slalom and GS in '81, and I wasn't sure whether I would be a slalom skier or a downhiller. And then after I came back from that ACL, I got some very good results in downhill, and I was kind of riding on the coattails of Konrad Bartelski, who was, the experienced elder statesman on the team, and I learned a lot from him.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, how did you find that step up? Because presumably you started off did they still have the Europa Cup circuit? Was that the kind of lead into World Cup?
Yeah, I kind of bypassed Europa Cup. I just went straight to World Cup, and I was kind of chasing Conrad on the World Cup. But my brother did a lot of Europa Cups when Jimmy Smith, the legendary Jimmy Smith, was his coach on the British team. But I was with Conrad, and the coach was Conny Rupprechter, the Austrian fun guy, sadly no longer with us. And I had a baptism of fire. I had a few injuries, but I was also very much inspired by Steve Lee, the Aussie racer who I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, who's just a couple of years older than me. He was making great strides forward and got a top 10 in Kitzbühel, and I was really chasing him as well. So it was a fun time, and I probably didn't realize how dangerous it all was, but when you're in your late teens and early 20s, you have no idea and you think you're just unbreakable, don't you? That's just how it is.
I guess you do, and I guess maybe all young men, young people may take risks at that age that they wouldn't take, but not everybody, gets on to racing downhill on races like Kitzbühel and Wengen. Were you training? You mentioned you were lucky enough to benefit from the experience of Konrad Bartelski. Were you training with other nationalities because there wasn't necessarily a British team set up, or did you have a British team to support you?
Well, we had a British team, and there were other downhillers around at the time, like Freddie Burton and Boris Duncan and John Clark, who is better known as the British disabled team coach these days. But when you're running downhill training, you need a lot of personnel on the hill to patrol the hill, just to keep the public off it if you're up on a glacier. So we would work with other teams. We'd work with the Canadians and Americans quite a bit. We'd work with the Aussies. We'd work with the Germans quite a bit as well. And really anyone who would have us. But we had particularly close ties to the Canadians and Americans because of, the language issue. And, we got some good training, and we even worked together at the races quite often. We would have, different coaches at different parts on the course, so you could video and watch the race. And it was, the only way you could do it really in the speed events.
Right, that's great to hear that you had that kind of assistance there. Was that the era of what they termed the crazy Canucks then?
It was just after, really. Steve Podborski and Ken Reid, they were the same era as Conrad. And in fact, Ken Reid back in the 70s, he used to train with the British team quite a bit. Funnily enough, it was actually Ken Reid who advised me to think about sending our daughter to Denver University, because his son, Eric Reid, also went there and has since done quite well on the World Cup tour. So yeah, it's a small world. And the Crazy Canucks were really the trailblazers for the Canadian team. And then my era, there were people like Rob Boyd and Brian Stemmel and Todd Brooker following in their footsteps. And then, of course, with the Americans, there was the unique Bill Johnson, who won the Olympics in Sarajevo. He's sadly no longer with us, but he was quite a character and he had quite a life.
So I mentioned that you took part in over 150 World Cup races. Most people think of you as a downhill racer, but I think I'm right in saying that your 11th at Lillehammer in 1988 is the best Super G result by a Brit. Must be nice to have that on your CV as well.
Well, Super G was a new event. When I got onto the World Cup, it had literally just been introduced, I think, in '82. So, I gave it a try, and really, Graham and I were better at downhill. And in the 80s, Super Gs could vary hugely. Sometimes it would almost be like a slightly faster giant slalom. Sometimes it would be like a downhill with a couple more turns. And, that time in Leukebad, I got a little bit lucky. It was a fairly fast course. And I had a good run. And Super G is an event where Britain hasn't really moved on and had anyone in the top 10 yet. So, that record is there to be broken. I noticed in fact, yesterday we had two young Brits do quite well in the World Junior Championship Super G. So maybe they'll be the ones to aim for that record.
Excellent. Well, that's interesting to hear you talk about, the younger generation coming through. We obviously mentioned Reece earlier, and we have Beijing coming up next winter. Hopefully Tokyo will go ahead, but it might be that Beijing is the next Olympic event on the calendar at all. Is there anything that you're particularly looking forward to watching, at Beijing?
Well, I mean, like any Brit, obviously the men's slalom. What Dave Ryding has achieved is... I think a lot of people don't realize how difficult it must have been for Dave to get to where he is and what he's achieved, to land on a World Cup podium. I spent 14 years trying to get onto a World Cup podium, and I got, 2 places away was the closest I got. And it is so difficult, even just to get in the top 30 of a World Cup. When you realize the huge national systems that you're up against with the big alpine countries, these countries they spend millions on their ski teams, like their kind of feeder teams, their regional teams from, like, say, the Tyrol or the Salzburg area. These races on these teams are probably better supported than the British team races are. And it's a whole pyramid, from the ski academies all the way up. And to actually be competitive against these nations is not easy at all. I have to say, I was lucky enough to coach Dave at Rossendale Dry Ski Slope when he was like 14, 15 years old. And he looked promising then. I mean, he was very talented, had very quick feet. I thought he would be a decent slalom skier. I had no idea. If you'd told me that he would be on a World Cup podium then, I would have laughed at you. So it is amazing what he's achieved.
That's great. I mean, I've interviewed Dave for the podcast a few times, and not only has he done very well, he's a very nice and modest kind of guy about it as well. So I'll be looking out for that one as well, and hopefully there'll be other British skiers coming through. You mentioned the competitors at the World Junior Championships as well. So I'd really like to thank you for your time, Martin. That's brilliant. I really enjoyed maybe a trip down memory lane and finding out a bit more about your racing experiences from the 80s and 90s. I'd like to wish you all the best for the rest of the winter, and for Reece as well, and we'll be looking out for her. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Ian.
Hi there, listener. Ian here. I just wanted to let you know that you can now support the Ski Podcast at buymeacoffee.com. This blank season has been a tough winter for all snow lovers. I've spent a lot of time and put in a lot of effort to try and give you an episode every week through this winter to give you your taste of snow, even if we can't go out there ourselves. Now, I do it anyway because I love skiing, but if you do enjoy the Ski Podcast and you'd like to support us, then you can literally buy me a coffee, or in my case a tea, at buymeacoffee.com. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/the Ski Podcast. Thanks very much.